welcome again to a new year of webinars for small business, Connecting for Success. That's going to be our series title. I'm Barbara Coffey, Director of Economic Initiatives for the City of Tucson. As we work our way through this pandemic and into a new year of challenges and opportunities, I thought it would be ideal to start off with the lay of the land from both a legislative standpoint and an economic one. We'll take your questions as we go, so feel free to enter those in the chat box or in the Q&A section, and we'll get to as many of those as possible in our time together this afternoon. We will keep all participants muted since we have a large number of attendees, but we will record the session and make it available for everyone tomorrow. You can find links to all previous webinars at connecttucson.com. So let's get started. First up, Andrew Greenhill. Andrew is the Intergovernmental Relations Manager for the City of Tucson and Tucson Water. In this role, he manages all federal and state issues for Tucson. This includes addressing legislation, securing funding for critical Tucson projects and programs, and protecting local authority. Prior to his current role, Andrew served as Chief of Staff for then Mayor Jonathan Rothschild and Assistant to the City Manager for the City of Tucson. With that, I'll turn it over to you. Welcome, Andrew.
Great. Well, thank you, Barbara, and thanks to the economic initiatives folks, all of you in the City of Tucson, and everything y'all do for economic development and supporting business in Tucson. So for me, thanks for the introduction. I'm Andrew Greenhill, and again, I've been with the city in total for over 20 years. I've worked in a number of capacities. I currently run the government relations for the City of Tucson, and in particular, I work a lot on state and federal issues. So that covers everything from working with our delegation and the administration in Washington, supporting projects and programs, funding, legislation, all kinds of issues that affect our projects and programs here in the City of Tucson. And then when it comes to the state, I work with the governor's office and agencies. I work with members, both from the Tucson area as well as across the state. On again, all issues that affect the city. As you can imagine, that keeps me very busy during the legislative session, which just started last week, a couple weeks ago. And already there's over 1,000 bills at the legislature that have been introduced. And I get to go through all the bills and work with our mayor and city council and our city staff to make sure I have a good sense of what the bills do and give recommendations to the mayor and council about whether those bills are consistent with the goals of the city and the mayor and council or not. And I give them recommendations on whether to support or oppose, monitor, etc., the different bills. I very much enjoy the work that I do for the city, and I feel like the last year, as difficult and challenging as so much has been in this past year, it's been a year where the way in which we've been able to work with the federal government in particular has led to some significant benefits to the city, in particular related to federal assistance for local governments. The City of Tucson has been able to secure over $150 million in 2020 to help us, maintain our critical programs and services for our community, as well as provide assistance to small businesses, helping meet housing and utility needs, nutrition needs, and other critical needs during the pandemic. So it's been a big year. We've already been able to secure another $35 million recently from the federal government for additional rental and utility assistance in the City of Tucson, as well as another $16 million for transit to make sure that our transit system can function, especially at a time where, again, people, it's a difficult time, and it's actually enabled the mayor and council to maintain our system even without charging fares. So that's critically important as people try to get back to work and to school and try to get back to what we seem to remember as normal, but may not be normal going forward. So with that introduction, I've put together a presentation today, and what I've focused on in my presentation is just looking at the last COVID relief bill from the federal government. and looking particularly at programs in that, or provisions in that bill that affect or aim to support small business. And I'll be focusing in 3 different programs that were in the bill that I think folks may want to know more about. And then I'll cover a little bit about what may be in the next federal bill, at least what's in President Biden's proposed plan for additional stimulus. I'll cover that real quickly, and then I'll transition and real quick to the state, and at least what the state has reported in terms of expenditures they've made to support small business, or at least the small business environment in the state of Arizona. So with that, let me see if I can get this going. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay, let me. How's that? Great.
That's great. Awesome.
All right. So I'll go through this. So federal COVID-4 relief. COVID-4 is short for the last COVID bill. There were 4 different bills over 2020, including this last 4th bill that was signed by President Trump on December 27th. It had about $900 million in COVID relief, in addition to a $1.4 billion spending bill for fiscal 21. So together about $2.3 billion in spending. There were some small business related provisions in that bill that I will cover. And then of course, like I said, I'll cover some of the state spending so far on supporting small business. So again, real short, what federal and state programs are available to assist small business? That's what I will cover here today. So the 3 federal programs in the COVID-4 bill that I'll cover today, and you've probably heard of at least one of them, if not more. There's the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program. And the headline is that the latest bill includes another $284 billion in support of that program, in addition to enabling second loans. So even if you've gotten a loan in last year, this bill enables businesses and nonprofits to get a second loan. And in addition, there are some new entities that are eligible to receive PPP loans, and I'll talk about that later. The second is called EIDLs, or Economic Injury Disaster Loans. Those loans are still available, but there was an extension of a subset of that program, which includes some grants. About $20 billion has been made available for targeted grants, and by targeted, that makes them low-income community businesses are eligible for those grants. And then finally, there's a specific program for a very specific subset of businesses, live venues. So shuttered venues, live venues that have had to shut down or have been significantly negatively impacted by the pandemic. There's a $15 billion program specifically for those types of entities. And I'll cover some of the details on that program as well. So first, the PPP, just to cover it, kind of give an overview. Small businesses are eligible to apply for up to 250% of their average monthly payroll expenses and potentially forgivable loans. In the first round of the PPP, a total of over 85,000 Arizona businesses were approved for loans for about $8.7 billion that came from the federal government to Arizona to support Arizona small businesses. So here's the difference between the last PPP and the current one. So as many of you know, there was some controversy over the types of businesses that were receiving the PPP loans previously, especially large businesses that were chains that are just, that seemed to be financially healthy, or at least didn't seem to fit the description of what many people thought of as small business. So this time around, Congress changed the PPP program. So first, it was businesses with fewer than 500 employees were eligible to apply, and the maximum loan was $10 million. Under the new program, businesses have to have fewer than 300 employees, You have to be able to show a revenue reduction of 25% to be eligible, and the maximum loan amount is $2 million. The other extension of the program that's worth mentioning is that last time it was only open to small businesses and 501c3s. This time it's 501c6s are now eligible. So organizations like chambers of commerce or tourism marketing entities, those entities are now eligible for PPP loans. Just like before, loans are 100% backed by the Small Business Administration. You can obtain them through participating banks, so work with your banker. Loan monies can be used for payroll, mortgage interest, rent payments, and utility services. And if you use it for those expenses, the loans can be forgivable and can turn into a grant. If no employees are laid off, the entire loan is forgiven. If some employees are laid off, the forgivable amount is reduced by the percentage of employees that were laid off. Loan amounts that are forgiven may be excluded from businesses' gross income for federal income tax purposes. So that's another potential benefit to small businesses. If you are approved for a PPP loan, you have to claim it within 10 days of it being offered to you. Otherwise, the offer is rescinded. So important to remember. I'll make this PowerPoint available to Barbara, who can then put it somewhere where folks can access it. And here you could just see a whole slew of links to the proper forms, et cetera, where you can get more information or even apply for PPP loans. So that's the first of the three types of programs that support small business in the COVID-4 bill. The second I want to point to is the EIDL, the Economic Injury Disaster Loans. These are loans. These are loans that cannot be forgiven, so they do not become grants under any circumstances. You can apply for these up to $2 million to cover operating expenses, including providing sick leave to employees, wages, supply chain cost increases, rent, and other liabilities that cannot be paid due to revenue decreases. The rates on these loans are 3.75% annual for businesses and 2.75% for nonprofits. As I said, they can't be forgiven into the end of 2020. According to the state, over 60,000 Arizona businesses had received these EIDLs, bringing $3.2 million in funding to the state. So those loans are still available. There was also a program that was available last year that is actually now not available. I still want to go over it because it helps explain a new program that is available. So if you'll bear with me, last year there were these emergency advance loans, but they really were grants. And what they were was you can apply and get up to $10,000 within 3 days. You can use it for the uses that you can see there on the screen. And you can see that over 90,000 Arizona businesses received over $329 million in these EIDL advances. Now, there was controversy over these as well. And so in the new COVID-4 bill, Congress decided to curtail this program somewhat. So now there's still some advance grants available, but they're targeted. And basically what it means is the grants are available, but the applicants have to be located in low-income communities. And there is a definition of what that means at SBA, the Small Business Administration. And these grants are available if you're in that low-income community, or you receive less than $10,000 from the first round, or didn't get in the first round due to lack of available funding. There was $20 billion made available in this COVID-4 bill for those loans, or grants, I should say. And if you are eligible, there's actually, SBA is saying you don't need to do anything. They will contact you. If I were eligible, I might still make a call, just knowing how the federal government works. But this is at least what they are saying. Now, I believe there will be more guidance coming from the federal government and the Small Business Administration on these grants, but businesses that are eligible might want to look into them. And again, here's just a link to all the different EIDL grant programs or loan programs at the Small Business Administration. And so finally, the last set of, the last provision I want to point to, and again, I know this is tailored to a very specific industry, but it is one that has suffered significant negative impact due to COVID. And so it's the shuttered venue operators, or it's all otherwise been called the Save Our Stages program. For short, we'll call them SVO grants. So in the COVID-4 bill, there's $15 billion in grants for shuttered venues. It is going to be administered by the Small Business Administration, and in particular, their Office of Disaster Assistance. Eligible applicants, you may qualify if for equal to 45% of your gross earned revenue. And I believe that's going back to your 2019 year, but again, the specifics are still being developed. With a maximum amount available for a single grant of up to $10 million, $2 billion of the $15 billion is reserved for smaller venues, the ones that have up to 50 full-time employees. And for this program, it's kind of interesting. Funding is phased in based upon the degree of revenue loss. So to just put a finer point on that, and I know this may be a little difficult to see, but I took it directly from the website. So what they're going to do is they're going to start by saying, if you're an eligible entity that suffered 90% or greater revenue loss between April and December 2020 due to the pandemic, then you are eligible for grants in that first tranche, so to speak. You're the first priority. So they'll have that available for 14 days once the grant awards are available. They are not available yet, but the first 14 days will be, they'll be looking for folks that have had that 90% or more revenue loss. After 14 days, they'll open it up to those who can show 70% or greater loss. And then after that, it'll be 25% or greater loss, and they'll keep going until they either run out of money or they can get back to others. As you can see, that supplemental funding in the last category, those who suffered a 70% or greater loss for the most recent calendar quarter. So even looking into 2021. So who are the eligible entities? Live venue operators or promoters, theatrical producers, live performing arts organization operators, relevant museum operators, zoos and aquariums. So I'm in fact looking at this program to see if perhaps even the city zoo might be eligible for some funding. Again, there's still some guidance that we're looking for from the SBA, and we'll see how they further define some of these eligible entities. But going on, motion picture theater operators, talent representatives, business entities owned by eligible entities that meet the eligibility requirements. When I asked about, well, what is that? I've heard, well, there may be a theater that also has a separate LLC for, say, their ticket sales, right? So that ticket sales LLC that's really part of the same entity would also be eligible. So that's just one example of what that last category might mean. As I mentioned, more guidance is needed here. There's still a lot of questions that folks have, and they've made a change recently about the first round of funding. First, it was going to be only 50 employee entities or fewer. Now they're saying that no, they're not going to limit it to that, although they're still going to stick with the $2 billion of the $15 billion has to be for entities, 50 employees or less. Also, it's still not clear if when they talk about 90% revenue loss or 70%, it's still not clear how that's calculated. Is it gross or earned revenue? So still a lot of questions on that program. Also, I'll note that if you happen to be eligible for this type of grant, if you apply for it, you are then ineligible to go for a PPP loan as well. So you may want to look at everything, all the different programs, and be strategic about what type of grant you're applying for, even if you might be eligible for both. And again, here some links to federal websites that give far more information about these types of grants, including actually a link to a YouTube webinar here where the Small Business Administration gave an overview of at least what they're working on in terms of giving more guidance and getting to the point when they can be open for business and actually taking in applications and giving out grants. So looking ahead, the President Biden, announced recently that in addition to the $2.3 trillion that was approved on December 27th, the president is interested in a new additional stimulus plan. That plan in total would come to about $1.9 trillion of federal support for everything from families to local governments and state governments, additional funding for testing, tracing, and vaccine programs across the country, and more. There are some small business provisions in this plan, and I just took the next couple of slides directly from President Biden's website. So here you can just see the direct quote about small businesses need funding to reopen and rebuild. And it talks about how nationally small business revenue is down 32%, and at least 400,000 firms have permanently closed. So just to give a sense of the scope of the problem facing small businesses across the country. Specifically, and we don't have any more details than what's here, so I can't with any real confidence describe exactly what these provisions mean, but here's what they are. So first, the president is recommending a $15 billion grant program and flexible, equitably distributed funds that would help small businesses get back on their feet and build back better. And the goal is to help more than 1 million of the hardest hit small businesses. Again, it raises a lot of questions just about the who and what, but that's what we know at the moment. And then also he's talked about leveraging $35 billion in federal government funds into a $175 billion fund that would provide lending and investment for small businesses across the country. Again, there aren't a lot of details on that, but that's what the president is proposing. These and other proposals will now go to Congress, and Congress, working with the administration, will see what it can pass. I know that the House is likely to take up consideration of a new stimulus bill next week, and we'll see how far that goes. And if they pass something, then of course that will go to the Senate. So with that, I'll quickly transition to the state of Arizona. I'd say that in general, most of the support for small business has come from the federal government, but there's been some monies that have been appropriated by the state legislature that the governor has been able to use in order to assist business around the state. Given it's the state, not the federal government, these are far smaller sums of money, but there has been at least some activity at the state level as well, and I did want to highlight at least some of those expenditures. In general, before the state legislature declared sine die and ended their 2020 legislative session, the legislature did appropriate in a couple of different funds about $105 million for COVID relief to make that available to the governor. About 50 million of that, or 55 million of that, was really meant for, PPE, testing, tracing, the kind of direct health and safety needs of the state. And then there was another $50 million appropriated by the legislature to help, whether it's people facing eviction, small businesses, etc. So what you see on the screen are some of the appropriations or allocations that the governor has made using some of those dollars. And it's not a long list and it's not a lot, but I did want to make sure that at least as of the end of last year, these are the appropriations that the governor has made from some of those funds that are meant to assist small businesses and organizations around the state. So of these, I just want to highlight the ones that I think most closely touch small business. So there's the $600,000 that went to the Arizona Small Business Association that helped launch the Live Local program to assist small businesses in finding resources during the COVID-19 outbreak. There was $1 million that was given to local chambers of commerce around the state to implement programs geared towards accelerating local economic recovery, $3 million to establish the safest outside restaurant assistance program, providing funding up to $10,000 per restaurant, distributed by the Arizona Commerce Authority, assisting businesses in creating or expanding outdoor dining spaces. I believe that was done in 2 tranches, by the way. I think there was 1 million and then subsequently 2 million right before the end of calendar 2020. And then $10 million to launch the Arizona Small Business Rent and Mortgage Relief Grant Program, partnering with Local First Arizona to launch this program. And it's meant to assist small businesses that had to close or pause their operations as a result of the June executive order, which is, the governor's limitations on some types of business activity. And it's supposed to help them meet their rent and mortgage obligations when they were unable to operate. With that, that's pretty much my presentation. Again, just a last plug. I know I've covered the federal government and the state government. I want to make sure those who are watching are aware of what the city of Tucson provides in terms of support for local business. Our economic initiatives team has put together connecttucson.com. And again, in addition to the federal and state resources, I want to make sure everyone knows that the city of Tucson has a lot of expertise and knowledge about programs that can help small businesses, and just wanted to make sure that even with the focus on federal and state, folks remember that the city is here to help as well. And that concludes my presentation. I will end the screen sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions or hear any comments you have. Thanks again for inviting me, and look forward to hearing more.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. And I did not pay you to say that plug for Connect Tucson. And actually, I would be hurt if most of the people on the webinar didn't already know about Connect Tucson. I think that's why we're here, but I'm so pleased that it has worked well for connecting us all. And again, appreciate, Andrew, the information today, because I think you shared some of the nuances of the programs, at least that are now coming again from our federal government for small business. And I think that was really helpful. It sounds like the federal government answered some of the criticisms that they saw early on in the pandemic with the programs. And so hopefully that will be beneficial. There's a question I did want to, any input on franchises versus the independently owned businesses as it relates to access to the PPP? There was a question, if a franchise operator has less than 300 employees, do they qualify regardless of the franchise? So that's nitty gritty. Do you have some insight on that?
Unfortunately, I don't.
Okay.
You know what? I'm not 100% sure of the answer to that, but I will find it and make sure I get it to you, and we can.
We will. And there's a good chance that our friends from the SBDC and the Arizona Commerce Authority and others are listening on here and may have some input. So we'll put that in the bin for later. So I appreciate that, and we're gonna keep moving. I've got a few questions that are lining up for as we go forward. There's one more though here. Any specific programs for small hotels, non-chain hotels? Again, that may be more fine line or some definitions that we need to dig into. What are your thoughts, Andrew?
I'm not aware of any programs or support programs that are specifically for hotel lodging, tourism, but they should be eligible like other businesses are for the PPP. For
the other programs, absolutely. Okay, fantastic. We're going to keep going. Next up, George Hammond, Director of the Economic and Business Research Center in the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona. He has decades of experience analyzing and forecasting state and local economies. His analyses have significant influence, reaching over 1,000 decision makers each year through conferences, publications, and press contacts. These have included NBC Nightly News, the Wall Street Journal, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, and local media. And I feel like there's a lot more than 1,000 people, George, that you've influenced. So thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us today. We may not be the nightly news, but I think we're a whole lot of fun anyway. So with that, George, if you can take the screen as well. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Barbara, and thanks for the opportunity to present. I really love what you're doing at the City of Tucson. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you can all see that now. So I'm going to talk about the current performance of the state and local economies and give you a feel for how I see the outlook going forward. I'm not going to be very specific about the forecast because things have been changing so rapidly that the last forecast that I did in December is not a good guide going forward. But I haven't done a new forecast that will be coming out in March. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more general terms, and we will have specific information and forecasts going forward later this spring. So let me begin with the key topics today, and you know, as always, since the pandemic began, the most important thing to keep in mind when you think about the future is that there is a lot of uncertainty about how things are going to pan out. We've learned a lot about the virus and the economic impacts of the pandemic, but there are still uncertainties to keep in mind. Nowadays, those uncertainties really revolve around the speed with which we'll be able to vaccinate a large percentage of the population. We're also hearing more and more about new variants of the virus, so there are uncertainties there to keep in mind as well. There are also uncertainties, as Andrew mentioned, about the federal response to the pandemic. And as I'll show you, and as Andrew has mentioned, the federal response has had a big influence on both our overall economic performance and our recovery, and also a big influence on certainly state government tax revenues. So uncertainties are going to matter here, and they will affect the speed of the recovery. And I'll give you some signposts to think about in terms of the speed of that recovery based on what's happened over the past 6 months or so. So the good news is that Arizona, while it got hit hard, it has outperformed the nation overall and many states. Now, through December, Arizona has replaced just over 69% of the jobs that we lost from February to April. During that February to April period, we lost about 295,000 jobs. That's about a 10% drop in state employment in just a couple of months. And that's comparable to what the state went through during the Great Recession, although that Great Recession downturn lasted about 3 years, not just 2 months. Now, the U.S. has also replaced a significant number of jobs, but not nearly as many as Arizona has. The U.S. has replaced about 56% of the jobs lost during that February to April period. Now, what we're seeing is pretty much as expected. The travel and tourism industry remains really weak. We track this based on a set of weekly indicators for things like TSA traveler throughput. We also track passenger traffic through Tucson International and Phoenix Sky Harbor. We track seated diners at restaurants, hotel occupancy rates, and a number of other indicators on our Arizona's Online magazine. And you can find that at azeconomy.org. But we have seen one industry in particular that's done really well during the recovery. And overall, retail trade and wholesale trade have done fairly well. They're basically back to where they were in February. But the transportation and warehousing sector is way above in terms of jobs where it was in February. And that reflects several factors. One is the acceleration in a shift to online retail sales during the pandemic. We've also seen a shift of spending as households, particularly households that have been able to maintain their employment and work from home, are finding, essentially all that spending that they would normally be doing on travel and tourism piling up in their bank accounts. And they are spending that money on tangible goods. And that's one of the reasons why taxable retail sales is doing so well here in Arizona. And it's also driving increased online retail sales. Also expanded delivery services are driving that transportation and warehousing employment in the state. The housing market remains pretty good, although construction jobs are down compared to where they were in February. We are seeing house prices rising rapidly, and that will impact housing affordability going forward. So overall, the outlook calls for the state economy, as well as the Tucson economy, to gradually improve as we go through 2021. Overall, the state is on track to recover all of the jobs that we've lost during the pandemic sometime in late 2021. Most of that recovery driven, at least initially, by Phoenix, although Tucson will gradually gain momentum as we go through the year. So let's take a look at what happened to employment. And this shows that huge job loss that we saw from February to April, the really quick bounce back in May and June. And the key thing to look at is what's happened since June. That reflects sort of the more normal job growth during the recovery. Now, overall, that's really pretty rapid growth on average for the state. Since June, the state has averaged over the month job growth of about 11,000 jobs per month. And that's much faster than our average monthly job growth before the pandemic, which was just over 6,000 jobs per month. But even at that 11,000 job per month rate, it will take us roughly until September to replace the 90,000 jobs that we still need to get back to where we were in February. So that's one signpost. If job growth going forward returns to that 6,000 job per month pace, it will take roughly about a year or until March 2022 for Arizona to get back to that pre-pandemic employment level. So just a couple signposts to keep in mind as you think about the pace of the recovery and what that really means. Now, one thing that we're seeing is that the recovery in Arizona is really unevenly distributed across the state. You'll notice at the top of this table that jobs in Flagstaff are still about 15% below where they were in February. Overall, the Sierra Vista and Prescott MSAs are pretty close to where they were in February. Phoenix, notice, is about 2.5% below where employment was in February. Here in Tucson, we're about 3.5% below where we were in February. And for both those metros, we're doing much better than the nation. Nationally, jobs are about 6.5% below where they were in February. But one thing to keep in mind is that since June, all of the job growth in Arizona has been in the Phoenix metropolitan area. Tucson hasn't seen much job growth since June, and that's really true for most of the metropolitan areas and the non-metro counties of the state. So since June, it's really been Phoenix that's almost completely driving the recovery. Now, I think that'll change as we go through the rest of this year, but really the rest of the state, except for Phoenix, is off to a slow start. So in terms of the unemployment rate, this is something that we haven't been talking a lot about because the data in Arizona for the current year, meaning 2020, was really volatile. And you can see the major zigs and zags that we saw. I think the one thing that we can safely say about the unemployment rate here in Arizona is that it's well below where it was in April at its peak. So we know the unemployment rate has come down, but we really don't have a very precise picture of how far the unemployment rate has fallen. I think that when the revisions are released in March to this data, we'll see that Arizona's unemployment rate is somewhere in the neighborhood, maybe a little bit below the national average through much of 2020 and into early 2021. So how is job performance breaking out across industries? Well, in Arizona, you can see that of the 90,000 jobs that Arizona needs to replace to get back to that February employment level, about half of those jobs are going to have to come in leisure and hospitality. It's down about 47,000 jobs from February. Professional and business services, these are primarily temporary help jobs, employment agency jobs. They're often the first to go during a downturn, and they're still far below where they were in February. Government jobs, especially local government jobs, are down significantly from February, as are education and health services jobs. Really, the one sector that's already more than replaced the jobs that it had in February is the trade, transportation, and utility sector. And again, that's primarily transportation and warehousing. But most sectors of the state economy are experiencing employment levels that are below February of last year. The Tucson picture looks a little bit different. We've seen significant and continuing job losses in professional and business services, as well as government, leisure and hospitality, and education and health. So a little bit different mix. We also want to keep in mind that the employment data for Tucson is subject to fairly big revisions. Those revisions will be released in March of this year, and we'll have a little bit clearer picture of exactly what happened in 2020 at that time. Now, this is what the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the federal entity that produces statistics like GDP and personal income, this is their analysis of the impact of the CARES Act on Arizona in the second and third quarters. This data is only available with a bit of a lag. And what's clear from that data is that those economic impact payments or the recovery rebates had the biggest positive impact, they brought the most federal dollars to Arizona in the second quarter, followed by the UI programs and then the Paycheck Protection Program. But that changed as we went into the third quarter, and there the UI programs and the Paycheck Protection Programs had a much bigger impact. We'll see something similar as we go through the fourth quarter. Once we get into the first quarter, we'll see a bigger impact again from those economic impact payments or recovery rebates. They'll reappear. The thing to keep in mind here is that once we add all this up for the year, it really will be those UI programs, unemployment insurance programs, and the Paycheck Protection Program will definitely have had the biggest influence on bringing federal dollars into the state to help stabilize the economy and households. Also keep in mind that the way these Paycheck Protection Program loans are measured in the national income and product accounts is that they don't actually show up in this data until they're actually forgiven. As long as they're loans, they're actually not picked up in the personal income or GDP accounts. So the long-term impacts of COVID. One thing that we know for sure is that the longer the pandemic lasts, the bigger and more extensive the long-term impacts will be. Right now, there's a lot of uncertainty about what that will be. I've been talking a lot about migration flows. It's looking more and more like those migration flows will be a significant impact. Arizona seems to be drawing migrants from other states. We typically draw migrants from California primarily, but really across the West. We do seem to be drawing additional migrants from the West who are interested in living in a state with a lower cost of living. The cost of living in Tucson is about 6.9% below the national average, but it's far below the cost of living in the major metropolitan areas like LA, San Francisco, and Seattle. So that's attractive to people looking for some place to live, particularly if they have the freedom to work from home. You can buy a house much more affordably here in Arizona and Tucson than you can in most of those other Western states. One of the big questions here for how durable this migration surge will be is what employers decide to do in terms of pay. Both Facebook and Amazon are talking about adjusting their remote workers' pay to reflect the local cost of living. If that's how it actually works, that will attenuate Arizona's cost of living advantage, at least to some extent. It may slow the migration flows after we get through this initial period. In terms of commercial real estate, there's still a lot of uncertainty about how durable remote work will be. There are some influential surveys coming out of Stanford by a gentleman by the name of Nicholas Bloom. His initial survey suggested that 20 to 25% of workers wanted to work from home full time. About 20 to 25% wanted to work in the office full time, and the balance, about 50 to 60%, just wanted more flexibility. Certainly I'm one of those. I have a pretty good internet connection, but the VPN to here at the U of A is really pretty slow. And I work with files that are just big enough that, working from home is pretty maddening. So I actually spend about half the day here in the office and about half the day working from home. I think there are a lot of people who are going to be in that sort of circumstance. So I think greater flexibility will be the order of the day for sure. And so offices I think will still be there in some form, but they'll look a lot different than they do at the moment. Now, online sales, I think that's really been accelerated by at least a couple of years by the pandemic, and that may really change the outlook particularly for retail space going forward. But again, there's uncertainty there as well. So residential real estate, people may be looking for bigger houses, bigger apartments that are structured a bit differently to accommodate working from home. And there may be a shift away from the city center. So we'll see. We've also seen trends towards automation accelerate. That's something that will likely continue, and that will have impacts on employment as well. So all things to watch as we think about the future. So in terms of house prices, just wanted to give you a sense of how that's changed over the past year. These are median house prices and the Case-Shiller index for Phoenix and Tucson. And you can really see there over the past year, house prices have really accelerated. Housing inventories are very low. We've seen almost an immediate response during 2020 with huge increases in housing permits being pulled really across the state and in Tucson as well. So we're looking for construction employment to gradually rebound as well, at least in that residential sector. So on the MAP dashboard at mapaz-dashboard.arizona.edu, we've done quite a bit of work on data that tracks house prices in Tucson compared to other Western metropolitan areas, other Western states, and the nation. We also track housing affordability. And you can see from this graph, which shows the share of homes sold that are affordable to a household, making the median income, that Tucson ranks really well. We've actually seen affordability go up in 2019, even though house prices rose fairly strongly. We're the most affordable market among those that we track on the dashboard. Only Albuquerque was slightly more affordable. Notice that we couldn't fit San Diego on the fuel gauge. Housing is so unaffordable there that if we tried to wedge it into the fuel gauge, all of the other Western metropolitan areas would be stacked on one side of the fuel gauge, and San Diego would be on the other. And the same would be true for LA and Seattle. So we really do have the advantage of relatively affordable housing, at least if we're looking at the single family housing market. But what we also track on the dashboard is a large number of indicators on housing cost burden. And one of the things that jumps out if we look at that data is that the housing cost burden is much more significant for renters than it is for homeowners in Tucson. So we want to keep that in mind. Renters do face a much more daunting picture than do homeowners. We also find that housing cost burden varies significantly by income level. So the higher income households face much lower housing cost burdens. The lower income households face a much bigger housing cost burden here in Tucson. So there's a lot to think about in terms of housing affordability. At the moment, housing affordability is a big draw for Arizona and for Tucson. As we go through this period of transition, and disruption in work arrangements. Arizona over the next year or so, I think will benefit from significantly increased migration into the state, and Tucson will pick up its share of those new migrants, and that will help to drive additional construction going forward, but it will also help to drive continued increases in house prices and rents. So the takeaways, you want to keep in mind that the outlook is still fairly uncertain. It's going to depend on a lot on what happens with the pandemic and the outbreak. There is light at the end of the tunnel. We are eventually going to get to the other end of the pandemic, and life will return to something that's much more normal. The Arizona economy has recovered so far much faster than the US and many other states, in part because we didn't have as significant a shutdown or a stay-at-home order as did many other states, particularly on the east and west coasts, and that helped. The outlook calls for Arizona to reach pre-pandemic employment levels sometime near the end of 2021, kind of in that late third to fourth quarter period. Tucson a little bit after the rest of the state. The outlook in the long run, both for Arizona and for Tucson, is positive. Arizona and Tucson are going to generate significant long run growth in jobs, population, and income. But we want to keep in mind that education is key, and investments in education will be key to driving innovation. And innovation is what really drives improvements in our long run standard of living. So making those investments in education across all the various levels is a key part of making sure that Arizona continues to be a place that's attractive to both businesses and to new residents. So with that, I'll conclude my prepared remarks and throw it back to Barbara.
Awesome. So I can hear the tweeting starting already, that Arizona's outpaced the US recovery so far. That's a good one for economic development. And so yes, share away. But I appreciate you framing the trends. I know there's still a lot of uncertainty, but you certainly have framed some of the trends that we're seeing or are going to expect to see. I was most interested about, seeing the hospitality, the lodging revenues are down. I think Visit Tucson reported 36% last year. And as you mentioned, that sector should see its increase this year with the jobs coming back. What else would you have to say locally about Tucson and the hospitality sector?
Yeah, as we get the vaccine more and more widely distributed, expect that to happen around the middle of the year. The hospitality industry I think will start to pick up steam gradually at first, but then with greater and greater momentum. The hospitality, the travel and tourism sorts of things that we all used to do, we all did them for a reason. They were a lot of fun. We really enjoyed it. Tucson and Arizona in general, really attractive place for people to come to visit. I mean, there's so many fun things to do, the gem show, all the outdoor activities that we have. People are still going to want to do that. That demand is there. There is some evidence in the national income and product accounts that there is income pent up, particularly for people who've been able to work at home and continue to work, who haven't seen big hits to their income. That income is going to be sitting in their bank accounts. And once they feel safe to go back out and do all those travel and tourism things that are so much fun here in Arizona, they're going to do that. And they may do that more than they ordinarily would, just to make up for some of that lost time. I think we're all looking forward to a lot of meals in restaurants and stays in hotels and resorts and doing all that fun stuff that we used to do. So I think it's going to come back, and it's going to come roaring back once we get enough of the population inoculated so that everybody feels a bit safer.
Yeah. And, Tucson, nothing keeps Tucson down. I'll say that. I watched over the weekend the different events around the Dillinger Days happening, and the creative response that the Hotel Congress did with their event, but having the virtual tour of the Dillinger courtroom and all these things. And I just feel like we've been playing full out trying to get through all of this. So I would ask, and Andrew, maybe you can share one of the questions related to Arizona legislature. And George, you may have some thoughts too, but what is your opinion of what is going to happen in the legislative session this year at the state level? The questioner asks, given the turmoil in the GOP, I'll keep the editorial out of that, you decide, but what are your thoughts?
Sure. So there's a lot of turmoil, just to use the word that the questioner used, at the legislature. I'd say, first off, we're coming off a very contentious election season. Interestingly, even after all the money spent on campaigns, both Republicans and Democrats, the amount of money that was spent on these campaigns and political action committees just dwarfed what has been spent in the past on legislative races. But even after all that, the balance of power at the state legislature did not change, right? It's still a very slight Republican majority in the House by one vote, 31-29, which is what it was last year. It did narrow a little bit more in the Senate. So whereas it was a 17-13 Republican majority in the Senate, it's now 16-14. So again, one vote. But even though the margins are so narrow, I'm not sure that's changing the type of legislation that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of legislation about elections and wanting to change election-related rules and access to the ballot and voter registration rules. Clearly coming out of the last election, there's a number of bills where even, and actually just before this presentation today, I was watching a Senate Government Committee hearing on a bill that would take away some of the power of the governor to call for, to assert executive powers and issue executive orders and declaring emergencies. So even within, say, the governing majority Republican caucus, there's quite a bit of turmoil. So what will that mean in terms of the types of bills we're seeing? I'm not seeing too much different from the past, but there's an edge. And I think it's also just topical based on what we've seen recently with elections and with COVID. I think there are a lot of bills that are informed by some of the recent turmoil. I'd say that another wild card going into this session is COVID. Last year, we had to end session prematurely, or at least prematurely to some. And there was very little business done, including a skeleton state budget that they passed very quickly, and were not able to really complete their session. Well, they're back this year. They are operating in something of a hybrid environment, but will COVID cases force the legislature to adopt either different measures for how they do their business, or might they need to take a pause as well? I think that's a wild card that everybody's watching very closely. And again, we're trying to take it day by day. But for now, at least 2 weeks in, the business of the legislature continues. I'd say for people who are watching closely and are interested in the budget and some of the bigger items at the legislature, the governor released his executive budget recommendation, which includes a proposal for an income tax cut up to $600 million a year, phased in over 3 years. That would have significant impacts across the state. Obviously, those who would benefit from an income tax cut would benefit, but government entities, including cities and counties that depend on state shared revenue, would receive cuts because we'd be receiving
Okay, all right. No, I appreciate that. I think there's a lot that we have to look forward to in terms of how this turns out, as what Paul Harvey used to say, the rest of the story. But before we go, 3 words from each of you. I'll start with George. 3 words that might define or depict what you think 2021 will be about. What would be your 3 words, George?
Recovery, acceleration, and I'm thinking about restaurants.
Oh yeah, you have to think, especially in the city of gastronomy. How about you, Andrew?
Oh, I'll go with recovery. I think George hit that one on the nose. And then just 2 words, but really one concept, new normal. I think we're all
New normal.
figuring out what that is.
New normal. Fantastic. All right. Well, you heard it here. And so it's time to wrap up. We'll keep everybody on time. We'll be back next month. We've switched to monthly. It'll be Monday, February 22nd at 3 p.m. Watch your inbox for the announcement and registration link. We'll keep you connecting for success. Don't forget, you can call your City of Tucson Economic Initiative Small Business Hotline at 520-837-4100. You can also visit connecttucson.com for resources and to sign up for our email newsletters and updates. So with that, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thank you.